this photograph was a part of my slides before, but now it's the actual title slide. And so, and it's in here just to get us thinking about this as, thinking about the Rio de Flag as a watershed. So having that full connection between the channel and all the way up to the high parts of the San Francisco Peak, so we can start thinking about it in that way, both visually and mentally. So let's go to the next slide. So this speaker series is part of a series of public meetings and presentations that are feeding into a watershed plan for the Rio de Flag that was first envisioned by Friends of the Rio de Flag, and who put in an application to the Bureau of Reclamation's Water Smart grant program and successfully were awarded the grant that's funding this whole process. And that Water Smart program is really geared towards community-based watershed planning. So really bringing a broad set of stakeholders together in a community to look at the watershed as a whole and address those issues that might be coming down the road that might be difficult to work out if you haven't already established some trust and some working together and a vision for how to deal with things going forward. So our goal with this grant and with the watershed plan is to develop a sorry about the comma there, but a living community-based watershed plan, and then collaborate as this expanded watershed stakeholder group that we've formed, the Watershed Alliance for the Rio de Flag. And through that Watershed Alliance, to develop this plan, get the community input that we're seeking in these speaker series, and identify and prioritize projects that we think are important to move forward with for the long-term, basically sustaining and enhancing this watershed. And then we would have metrics and evaluate the success of this plan as we're going along, and then adapt the plan going forward with the strategies that we learn. So next slide. And for the public and for all of you to be involved, and why this is important, it's absolutely critical. We need this broad set of ideas and experience and background and interest from all these facets of our community to come up with the best plan. And each of these 6 Explore the Watershed sessions are featuring this interactive map, survey, and question where you can provide geographically based comments and input into the plan. And this is the 3rd one. So we've been posting the Zoom recordings and also the interactive map that folks can go back to and continue to add comments to as we go forward. And that's all on the Watershed Alliance for the Rio.net. And just this general thing of what will this do for our watershed? We seek to bring together conservation, awareness building, and restoration activities throughout the Rio de Flag watershed. So this is as a collaborative, coordinated, and very inclusive community effort. So with that, I will hand off back to Carrie.
Great, thank you, Kelly, and thank you all. And we're continuing to admit people into the meeting. So if you just joined, welcome. I know that for the most part, we're all very in tune with Zoom and this virtual world, but just in case, it's always nice to go over a couple of Zoom tips. First being how to turn your audio on and off. A lot of this will be presentation for the first half and then community dialogue for the second half. So if you would like, especially if you have barking dogs, or generally in my case, kids in the background, having yourself on mute is helpful. You can also turn your video on or turn your video off. We understand this is the dinner hour. So if you just want to have some food and turn your video off and listen, that's great. If you would like to turn your video on, we definitely welcome that as well. We will be, throughout the presentation process, we will be asking you to put your questions in the chat box. So that's this little icon here, looks like a little word bubble. Please feel free to use that. We will be monitoring it as we go. Participants, if you would like to raise your hand, either on the screen, raise your hand, or you can click on your name in the participants tab and raise a little blue hand. We will make sure to get to you. Also, if you would like to change the view, you can use this gallery view, which is the many gridded pictures. That way you can see as many of us on your screen as possible. And as always, if we were in person, and especially now since we're virtual, we just ask everyone to use standard conduct of meetings, respectful behavior, and please stay engaged, because this is really important. And the reason we're doing this is because we really value and need your feedback for this process. To give you an agenda for tonight, and a quick introduction of myself, my name is Carrie Eberly and I work for Southwest Decision Resources. We are on contract with Friends of the Rio through that WaterSmart grant to be facilitators and to really help engage the community the best we can. My colleague Lisa, if you want to raise your hand quick, Lisa, she and I will be working in tandem tonight, facilitating, taking notes and moderating the chat box. So feel free to shoot us any questions you have. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Like Kelly said, this is the third of this 6-part speaker series. We try and frame them all similarly. We have a panel presentation. I will introduce the panelists this evening. We will have a quick break. We will have a group discussion where we're going to ask you guys to kind of think about 2 large questions surrounding the topics of the evening, and then a survey at the end. We like to try and keep you guys as engaged as possible, so we have a couple of different strategies we use, and we will be queuing one up here in a minute. But just for the sake of trying to see who, I'm going to turn this off for 1 second. Who, can I get a show of hands of people who attended either the first or the second session, or is the seeing some hands? Great. Excellent. Thumbs up. Perfect. Love it. Awesome. So good showing. And it looks like there's quite a few who have not attended. So welcome to the first one of your choice. And we hope to engage you throughout this process in the next 3 as well. So for tonight, we have 4 wonderful expert speakers that will be talking about Nature Elevated, benefiting native ecosystems. And the first one we'll be hearing from is Larry Stevens from Wild Arizona and the Spring Stewardship Institute from the museum. The second is Hannah Griscom with Arizona Game and Fish, followed up by Paul Byer, Friends of the Rio, and rounding it out tonight with Tom Whittam from NAU. So right before we get launched into the speaker series, Lisa is going to put the Mentimeter link in the chat box. If everyone can go to the chat box, open it up, click on that link, and let us know what neighborhood you live in Flagstaff. That would be great, and I will present those results as they come in. So as you can see, as more people enter their neighborhoods, the size and the orientation of those words changes. So as people keep adding, it looks like there's big showing from Donny Park tonight. Excellent. This is great. So keep on putting those in there. I can see down in this bottom corner that of the 35 people in here, only 17 have put their neighborhood in there. All right. Oh, great. And a lot of people are putting them in the chat box. If you want to, if you've already put them in the chat box, that's fine. If not, you can click on the link that Lisa put in the chat and you can enter your neighborhood into this Mentimeter, which will give us a word cloud. The more people who enter the same neighborhood, the larger those words get. So this gives us a good idea of who we're engaging throughout this process. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. We really appreciate it. Feel free to continue doing that as we move into the beginnings of this presentation. All right. So we're about to launch into the presentation for this evening. I want to reiterate again that a lot of amazing content is going to be covered. And if you have specific questions for the presenters, please put those in the chat box as we're going through, because we don't want you to forget them. And we'll make sure that those get addressed. We'll be asking the presenters when they're done to either kind of check the chat box. If you have one that's specific to a presenter, please indicate that in your question. Like, this is specifically for Paul addressing this question, or another speaker. All right, let's see. All right, so that was the agenda for the evening. We hope to be done with the bulk of it by 7, but we always like to keep the Zoom open for an additional 15 minutes if there's people who want to stay on and chat about some of these issues. All right, so Larry, you are up.
Larry, can you find the unmuting? Let's see.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay, good. Very good.
Fantastic.
And is the sound quality all right?
Yes.
I'm sorry to be calling in remotely, but I'm at a place without too much computer access.
It sounds
No
great.
worries.
Yes.
All right. Well, Carrie, if you could start the slides there, if you have them.
Yes,
And,
I started. I've moved on from your title slide to the first one on life zones.
Very good. Thank you very much. So I'm Larry Stevens. I'm the curator of biology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. I'm also a collaborator with Wild Arizona, and for the last 50 years, I've been studying Northern Arizona. And I think a lot of us don't realize how important Flagstaff and the watershed actually is to us. Rio de Flag watershed is a pretty humble kind of drainage and I think in our provincial view, but we must remember that the San Francisco peaks, the life zones there across elevation were the first and remain the premier elevation climate gradient studied in North America. And Seahart Merriam in the early 1890s, late 1880s and 90s, came to Northern Arizona and examined the distribution of life across elevation. Elevation determines a lot of the climate, and therefore understanding these climate elevation relationships allows us to use a space for time, or elevation for time kind of analysis of how climate change might affect our landscapes. Merriam was repeating a study that Alexander von Humboldt did on Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador, almost 100 years before, but nonetheless, bringing that attention to North America was really an important step forward. So this landscape is that we have around us here consists of multiple biomes. A biome is a group of ecosystems that are related, and we have, for example, the Arctic alpine habitat, small amount of habitat up on the top of the San Francisco peaks. Remarkable group of species living there, with 76, I think, species that are related to the Rocky Mountains, showing us that we had a community connection to the Rocky Mountains from Flagstaff during the last Pleistocene period, and so quite a dramatic gradient there. Next slide. So in looking at these various biomes and the ecosystems that are within them, we have, of course, the largest continuous ponderosa pine forest in the nation around us. That extends up to about 9,500 feet or so, but above that, tundra vegetation on the very top of the peaks with unique species like the San Francisco Peaks groundsel there shown in the yellow box. We have quite a few other ecosystems in the landscape, though, that are worthy of attention. The south side of Mount Eldon, not Mount Elder, but Mount Eldon, is a landscape that is quite remarkable. It has a host of species that are found typically farther south, right along the Mogollon Rim or down off the Mogollon Rim. Agave and alligator bark juniper and really a pretty much unexplored invertebrate assemblage living there. So that's really quite a unique environment. If you hike up Fat Man's Trail, you're going into a really unique world there. Next slide. Of course, water resources are key to life in the landscape. A lot of us think that the Rio de Flag, or have thought that Rio de Flag started at the highest point in the drainage, might have been Big LaRue Spring, but actually it's up at Vitt Spring, up at about 9,000 feet up on the peaks there. And springs are all across the landscape important points of flow, groundwater coming out of the ground, but also in terms of biodiversity and cultural significance and our history. In the biodiversity realm, springs function as what we might call keystone ecosystems, little patches of the landscape that are wet that support a unique array of species, but also provide a kind of a magnet source for water supplies for wildlife. So a small spring like Vitt Spring in the landscape serves a big role in terms of the functioning of the overall landscape for wildlife, bird life, and everything else. So these are great places to see wildlife. Some springs, we have about maybe 4 dozen springs on the San Francisco peaks, but quite a few in the inner basin have been diverted into the Rio de Flag watershed. Most of these have been pretty highly manipulated. For example, Big LaRue Spring has been known for a long time, and pretty much all the water has been, up until a couple of years ago, diverted to users out in the Fort Valley area and the Forest Service. But just recently it was partially rehabilitated by allowing water to flow there again. The next slide. By far, the most remarkable spring that we have on the San Francisco peaks is Snowslide Spring, up at 11,000 feet elevation in the upper part of the inner basin. It's diverted into the Rio de Flag through a canal system, but that diversion takes place down below where the source of the spring, and it's a beautiful, very strange stand of primula that exists at this spring. It really very much resembles a spring in the Sierra Nevadas. I've never seen one like it anywhere in the Rockies yet, but it's a really unique spring. It's completely unique within Arizona. So one worthy of our attention, even though it lies slightly outside the basin of the Rio de Flag. Next slide. Managing our ecosystems is always a discussion in this country about environmental versus economic effects. And so there's just this issue of strabismus where our eyes are out of binocular focus on these two topics. And I think the premise of this entire project is to start to break down those barriers and really be able to understand that our our social, our economic, and our environmental well-being and sustainability has everything to do with appropriate treatment of the environment, rehabilitating ecosystems where we can, understanding that we're having a tremendous impact on the landscape. Flagstaff is now a deciduous forest. Basically, it's a deciduous forest. I mapped it a few years back. However, it's an economically kind of based deciduous forest. Wealthier neighborhoods, particularly West Flagstaff, tend to plant aspens in their yard. East Flag is very strongly dominated by Siberian elm, a non-native tree. And so these are, just topics of quite interesting things to start thinking about. Or if the way we approach the environment is solely through the eyes of economics, we end up with a landscape of weeds. It's not as elegant and supportive of wildlife and compelling to our children and to our whole community as if we pay a little bit of attention to what trees are growing around us and manage that. Science and government also play a huge role in how we make decisions and what we use as information supporting decisions as how we move. And these four elements of the environmental concerns, economic concerns, science, and government are playing a role in our landscape. And let's work to bring these elements together to create a more sustainable, more beautiful, and more compelling landscape for ourselves. Thank you. Happy to take any questions too.
All right, I guess I'll jump in. Does that sound good, Carrie? Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Griscom. I work for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. Next slide, please. So I'm a habitat specialist for North Central Arizona, and I do a lot of wildlife related planning for development in Coconino County, as well as I kind of oversee restoration projects both in riparian and spring habitats and grasslands, which kind of got somehow dropped from my slide. But I work primarily in those kinds of ecosystems in this part of the state. And I've been really intrigued with the Rio since I moved here in 2014. I served on the board with the Friends of the Rio for several years and kind of delved in to historical conditions of the Rio, looking at the geology and biology of the past and present, in-stream flows with the city of Flagstaff, looked at recreational connectivity, and also did some work to kind of solve some mysteries about flow at Logan's Crossing and kind of what's happening to the water in Doney Park. So those are kind of the areas that have interested me the most about the Rio. Next slide, please. So I was asked today to talk about animals and wildlife in the Rio, which is really fun because you get to show pretty pictures of animals. And we have, like Larry was saying, if we think about the watershed and all of the elevational gradients and biomes that it encompasses, there's quite a bit of variability in ecosystems. And so we have quite a lot of native biodiversity when it comes to animals. And we have, upland species like mountain lions, Gunnison prairie dogs, which are keystone species for grassland ecosystems. And we have them at several places along the Rio de Flag. We have aquatic related species such as Arizona tree frogs and Wilson snipes and other sorts of water birds in the areas where we have either ephemeral or perennial water throughout the watershed. And then as far as threatened and endangered species, the only real relevant one that we have here is the Mexican spotted owl, obviously up at the higher elevations on the peaks. And so we're not, when we talk about restoration along the Rio and within the watershed, it's a fairly urbanized watershed. So we have a lot of biodiversity, but we don't have many threatened or endangered species to contend with, which simplifies things somewhat for us. Next slide, please. Non-native species, we don't have, I can't think of any major non-native mammals and birds besides our domestic animals, which are certainly an issue for native wildlife. But we do have at least a few species of aquatic non-natives, and so fathead minnow are a pretty common species throughout the Rio. They've been introduced by fishermen, and there's probably other species of non-native fish, including, of course, the fish that we stock at Francis Short Pond. These species are pretty hardy non-native species. I'm not aware of any really aggressive non-native species except for the American bullfrog, which is pretty much eats anything it comes across. And we know we have them in several locations along the Rio where we have perennial water. And so when we think about restoring aquatic species to the Rio, I think it's important to realize some of the limitations we have, certainly in terms of water quantity, but also water quality. We did some surveys of dissolved oxygen below Picture Canyon, and it's pretty clear that summer temperatures would probably, and dissolved oxygen and other chemical limitations would keep us from reintroducing native fish, such as the little Colorado spine dace within the Rio de Flag area. Another issue that we know exists is there's been some mutations in bullfrogs, like at the I-40 wetlands, probably due to pharmaceutical hormones in the water, in our effluent water. So in terms of restoration of native species, I think we have to certainly temper our expectations about where we can go with aquatics. There aren't, besides major carnivores, which we're unlikely to reintroduce within our urban area, we're probably not talking about reintroducing many species. Non-native plants, invasive weeds are a pretty big issue on the Rio. And we know that when we have large infestations, such as spotted knapweed and other species, it can really cut down on the amount of available habitat for native species. So that's an area where we can definitely make a lot of progress in terms of restoration for habitat for wildlife. Next slide, please. I wanted to just highlight briefly kind of the benefits that the Rio can provide for wildlife. It's an urban, I should say, parts of the watershed are very urban. And so we don't really want the Rio to be a huge wildlife corridor, because when you think about where it's taking animals from one end to the other, it's not necessarily going to be connecting great blocks of habitat for wildlife. But we do recognize that the Rio provides some unique habitat compared to the surrounding landscape. And so this picture on the left is the Rio de Flag, kind of near the center of town. And then on the right, you can see a roughly same area where we have elk collar data. And that the green dots that are kind of concentrated correspond to where the Rio is. So we know that elk, and probably other species, do concentrate and spend a lot of time down in the floodplain of the Rio, especially during drought periods where there's available food and water. So it's important to realize how the Rio provides this habitat and also think about not drawing them into places where they're going to get stuck. For example, I-40 wetlands, where the freeway goes over there, we have really high numbers of elk and deer that are getting killed right there. And that's probably because they're attracted to the water below the freeway. For whatever reason, they're trying to go up and over the freeway there. So as we think out with planning, we want to try to avoid those conflicts if we can with vehicles and other uses. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I think it's really kind of an attempt to get at the pros and cons of promoting wildlife on the Rio. You know, what are we restoring to, and what's realistic in the Rio? And we have to be honest with ourselves that the Rio is continuing to urbanize, and that as we work towards increasing usership along the Rio and increasing recreational use, there's going to be some trade-offs there with decreased use by wildlife. So I think, you know, we're not going to be trying to restore this to some sort of pristine habitat for wildlife, but probably most people can agree that we want to try to maintain as much as we can. We want to have native wildlife in the Rio and in, you know, where we live, but I think we have to be aware that there is a balance there. And there's potential for conflict when it comes to roads, you know, attracting wildlife to these places. And then if they can't get in and out, if they're surrounded by fences, roads, potential vehicle collisions, there's some planning we can do ahead of time to try to avoid those issues. So I think that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. And there's a couple of questions for you in the chat box.
Great. Crawdads, let's see.
If you could just address those in the chat box, that would be helpful so that we can move on. Paul?
Okay. All right. Here we're running a little behind, so go ahead and to the next slide. The next slide. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so I'm a wildlife ecologist. I've been working mostly in conservation planning. My specialty for the last 30 years has been wildlife corridors, mostly in the Western US, but other parts of the globe as well. This little example, just to give you an idea of what I've done in the past, is a corridor. This photograph is taken from the Santa Catalina Mountains, those mountains on the northeast side of Tucson, and you're looking out towards the Tortolitas. Those yellow lines delimit a half-mile wide corridor between those two areas. In 2016, as part of this conservation plan, there's a wildlife bridge built over Oracle Road there. And this will help as town of Oro Valley is annexing all of this land that you see in the lowlands in the foreground, that this will be conserved while the rest of it turns to urban areas. Next slide. Oh, this is for things like elk and mountain lions, Gila monsters, badgers. But what we're doing here is very different, and I'm real pleased. Hannah and I agree very well, so she set up a lot of the same ideas here. We don't really want corridors along the Rio that are going to connect. So those corridors down in the southern two mountain ranges we're connecting. We're not doing that. We're not trying to connect the peaks to, say, Walnut Canyon. So we don't want bears, mountain lions, and elk to move between those areas through town, or we don't want them really coming into town. So we're having some different kinds of connectivity here. We do want some corridors that are going to let some big wild areas like the peaks benefit some small semi-natural areas. And then some corridors to let these small semi-natural areas benefit the bigger patches. So we'll talk about both of those. Next slide. So here's an example. The peaks provide water that creates Francis Short Pond. It's a wonderful place. I'm sure every one of you has been there and enjoyed it. It's a cool place. It's a semi-natural area though. You have to admit that that structure there in the back of the pond, that's a dam. We created this thing. even though most of the water comes down the Rio, the city of Flagstaff releases water here under a contract with the Arizona Game and Fish Department to keep this thing topped off. As Hannah mentioned, the fish that is very popular here, people come here to fish. It adds tens of thousands of dollars to our local economy, but those fish are non-native rainbow trout. So it's what you'd call very much a semi-natural area, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people to interact with nature, care about nature, try and keep the environment clean. Here's an example. Collis Lovely took this picture of a bald eagle here at Francis Short Pond. So it's a great opportunity for people to connect with nature and love it. The lower right shows another opportunity that we have. There's the Rio de Flag coming underneath Interstate 40 and then flowing to the east. And that little blue patch is a perennial small pond where it's on city-owned property. It's an opportunity to create perhaps another fish pond, perhaps a cottonwood forest. We have some opportunities to do some cool things here. We're not going to call it wild nature. It's going to be semi-wild, but it's real opportunities to conserve native biodiversity and plug people into nature. Next slide. Here again, it's a selective corridor. This is some of the same areas that Hannah looked at, and you saw her picture of all those elk radio locations with the dots connected, and they're pretty much stopping at I-40. Well, here along the Rio, these are where the Rio crosses under I-40. Those are 60 or 70 foot bridges. That's not a barrier to elk. They can walk under there, but they don't. And the reason they don't is that the uplands are now occupied by urban areas. So they don't have the grasslands and those open pine forests that the elk need for their food. So this area is elk free. It creates a very interesting situation. We have elk on one side, not on the other. Next slide. What it does is it creates an opportunity for a corridor where the little urban natural areas are the important ones. The fact that we have no elk means we do have willows. So these are willows along, in the upper left, willows along Sinclair Wash. You will not see willows this big on the other side because the elk mow them down to ground level. And those willows, and we also have things that you also don't see in the areas occupied by elk, things like wild hops, Arizona red desert columbine, Arizona honeysuckle, wild grape, and then birds that use the willows, things like these blue grosbeak, lazuli bunting, yellow warbler. So it's cool. We have this opportunity for this area now to provide colonists that could, as we urbanize that area, that's all private land on the other side of Interstate 40, the elk will probably diminish. We have an opportunity for it to get recolonized by these plants and animals. So here the source is not going to be some big wild area. It's going to be these little semi-natural areas in this urban environment that we can use to recolonize those areas as they urbanize, and then other urban areas. If you look even just east of Lone Tree Road, that wash is pretty much denuded. If we restored vegetation there, we have some opportunities to create connections. Next slide. The elk-dominated area is also important, if for no other reason than we like elk. But I'll just point out it also has two prairie dog populations. They're regularly extirpated by plague, which is a non-native pathogen. And in fact, this area, the biggest oval here, that white oval, was the largest prairie dog town in the city of Flagstaff for the last several decades, a huge area. In 2015, plague entered that area. By spring of 2016, both of these prairie dog colonies were extinct. But right now we have massive connectivity from everywhere. This spring, 3 animals showed up in May of 2020. So presuming if they survive the winter, this colony can probably reestablish. It can then also provide propagules to this other area. This is the area where Kon Slobodchikov wrote the book literally on how prairie dogs, their complex vocal communication system. So it will be important as things evolve to try to, as things urbanize, to maintain these prairie dog towns and using the Rio as connectivity across those areas. Next slide, which I believe is the last, is that the real importance, I think, of the Rio de Flag is that it's connecting people and nature. So we're connecting nature to nature, species to species. We're allowing species to maintain gene flow, recolonize sites. But mostly for the Friends of the Rio de Flag, we hope that ultimately every resident of Flagstaff will be no more than a 10-minute walk from an urban trail that can connect them to this network of trails along our riparian areas of the Rio de Flag that allow citizens to connect to nature, and by walking just 3 or 4 miles to get out into those big areas that are predominantly natural. So with a combination of natural and semi-natural to create an experience for people. 2 things that I hope the Friends of the Rio hope to do. One is we're working now on developing a smartphone app, a tour to guide people to where some of these rare populations occur so that people can appreciate them and learn to treat them well. I hope we'll also, a few years ago, we started but never really launched an Adopt the Rio de Flag stewardship program, similar to the Adopt a Foots Trail, where people adopt a half-mile stretch and take care of it. I believe that's a great way then to help people connect to the Rio de Flag. With that, I've probably overused my time, so we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Tom, you're up. And you're on mute.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You're good.
Okay, so I'm Tom Whittam. I'm a professor at NAU. I've worked on riparian habitat most of my career. And the top photograph is one showing a fairly typical riparian corridor, and it's often referred to as a ribbon of green. And these riparian corridors tend to be very narrow and quickly move to upland species. They're also very sensitive to climate change. Because they're so dependent upon having some running water or a low, shallow water table. And they're hotspots of biodiversity, like 70% of the breeding birds here in the Southwest are in part or total dependent upon this very narrow strip. And the biodiversity here would be very high. The insect communities would be very rich. And what we want to make sure is that we don't go from a ribbon of green to a ribbon of death, like we see in the bottom panel, which is the Bill Williams River at Bill Williams National Wildlife Refuge, where declining water table and stream flows have basically killed off huge stands of gallery forest. Next slide, please. So a major climate change factor that's really playing a role here and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future are extreme temperatures. We generally focus, look at the lower left-hand panel, and extreme temperatures in terms of species extinction tend to be more important than mean annual temperatures. And so here we see temperatures from 1930 to nearly current. And you can see from up until the mid 90s, cold temperature extremes were what predominated. And they were virtually 2 times more abundant than high temperatures. But once we hit 1995 or so, you can see the graph just goes to all red. And so extreme temperatures are now the norm, not cold temperatures. And these extreme temperatures exceed cold temperature extremes by a factor of up to 7 to 1. And so now we're moving into a time dominated by extreme hot temperatures. And this is what is predicted for, I think, the foreseeable future. This last year is a prime example of this. I mean, we were just breaking records left and right. And so these extreme temperatures tend to really put a lot of plants at the edge of their physiological tolerances. And so in the upper left-hand panel, you see species richness of insects as a function of plant stress. And each dot is a tree. And you can see that as the stress index goes up, the species richness on those trees go down to near zero. So even if we manage to keep the plants on the landscape, if they're under extreme stress, they're likely not going to be supporting anything. And as the insects go, well, that'll probably affect the insectivorous birds and many other organisms. And so I think this is an increasingly common pattern, and it's just going to get worse. And then on top of that, plant genetics is a really major unappreciated point in wildlands. And here's just an example of a common garden embedded in wildlands. And you can see there's 4 genotypes. Genotype number, all of these genotypes have been clonally replicated, and so they're planted in blocks. And genotype number 1, those trees are doing really well. Genotype number 2 is also doing quite well, but it's just growing at a fraction of the rate of genotype number 1. Genotype number 4 completely died out, and genotype 3 wasn't much better. And so you can see that which genotypes or which plants we put in really matters, because some will do well and some will do terrible, and we don't want to waste our money putting in ones that are not going to do well. And that's going to be exacerbated by climate change. And then if we look at the right-hand panel, we see all the organisms that you would be finding on these trees. And they range from insects to fungi, bacteria, lichens on the tree trunk, pathogens. And all of these different communities are very sensitive to tree genotype. Different tree genotypes support different communities. And amazingly, these communities are really linked with one another, which is shown by the lines that connect those different communities. And so if you change the arthropods or insects on a plant, you will get a simultaneous change in the fungi on the roots, the lichens on the tree trunk, the pathogens, the twig endophytes, the soil fungi, and the soil bacteria. And that's because they're all linked. And we never previously appreciated just how linked these different communities were, all based upon the underlying genotypes of the trees. So which genotypes you put out there are going to affect these associated communities in a major way. Okay, next slide, please. And so to study climate change interactions with plant genetics of a common riparian species, Fremont cottonwood. This is one of 3 gardens we have with all the same genotypes, from growing from Yuma to, this is at Agua Fria National Monument on lands owned by Game and Fish, all the way up to Canyon lands. And basically, this is about a 4,400 tree common garden trees collected from all over the state. And some of them do great, some of them do terrible. But this allows us to identify the plants that will survive today and the plants that will survive tomorrow. They provide critical habitat. A single common garden can have over 700 species of insects on it. And so these are hotspots of biodiversity. We could actually do a similar sort of thing in a much more natural way. This is kind of a plantation planting, but they could be strung out in space so you'd never know it was part of an experiment. It looked very natural. And that could go various places along the Rio. And this could be done with, doesn't have to be cottonwoods, could be willows, whatever people think would be ideal for the Flagstaff area. And again, I would emphasize just how much biodiversity they support. But another thing that we would achieve through things like this would be Flagstaff, the Rio could become a genetic repository for various species that are likely to go extinct in springs that might dry up with future climate change, or intermittent rivers that become so intermittent they can no longer support riparian habitat. And so there are many species that would fall into this category of that would benefit from a repository. And a repository, I don't know of any other city in the country that has such a thing. And so just as we're very proud of our dark skies for a little observatory, we could become a genetic repository for spring species and other species that are plant species that are likely to go locally extinct. And so, and then one of the species that the endangered southwestern willow flycatcher has is a listed species, but also willow flycatchers use Flagstaff. Brian Hofstetter has saw a couple this spring there, or excuse me, this summer, and they're probably migratory, so they're not breeding here. But in any case, many animals at the very least need stopover points, and anything we do on the Rio to provide that kind of habitat would be extremely beneficial for lots of organisms. And then also, so two bright spots are that, you know, a genetic repository is a visionary approach to what the city could do, and it wouldn't have to take up much space, and it could look very natural. And then all of the species that it supports. And so, like I've said, in just one common garden, you could have at least 700 species of insects, which then supports so many different kinds of birds that depend upon them. And so it's a whole trophic level thinking about what do plants do for biodiversity. I would end on, next slide, please. Next, yes. And so here's kind of a success story. This is in northern Utah, a Superfund site. It's an abandoned military base, and it was nothing but Dyer's woad, which is an invasive exotic species that is particularly problematic in northern Utah. And we went in and planted native cottonwoods, and you can see 13 years later, it's a gallery forest with all the organisms that you would find. And this is an intercity area in a highly developed area. The military base was completely surrounded by housing and businesses. And now it's been turned into a nature center for that's annually visited by thousands of K through 12 students. And so it's a place where people, the locals, learn about conservation, restoration, and in this case, plant genetics, because we've done a lot of plant genetics here. So I think this is a bright spot. It all depends upon how much you want to do and who your target audience might be to appeal to. But I think the nature concept is a good one, and there's a lot of benefits. I'll end there. Thank you.